Hello and welcome to my Learning Journeys presentation where I present everything I've sort of learnt um, about visualizing peace and my journey into the idea of peace building, a concept I've never really touched upon before getting onto this virtually integrated project on visualizing peace, and how I want to utilize my background as a cell biologist to understand and to connect the concept of peace visualization and peace building, and to kind of make anybody more aware on the idea that peace building is a very interdisciplinary project and does not just require thought on conflict and how we can resolve that and think peacefully, but also looking at different other topics that can come in. And I wanted to present this in the form of a poster that's quite effective, to showcase how cell biology, a very academic kind of subject, can also link to peace building, which is such an important topic, particularly in light of conflicts across the globe currently. So the overarching theme of this idea is kind of presenting not necessarily a novel theorem, but placing a name to a theorem that exists across academic research papers and scientific articles that talk about this concept but don't really give it a name. So my idea with this is to actually sort of name an important concept utilizing biological research and peace building concepts, and to allow further peace building and peace change makers to take this concept and to maybe name it in academic research articles and to provide substance to it when referring to it. So the kind of the it is what I'm calling social homeostasis, which I will explain in a lot of detail, since the terms can be different depending on kind of who understands this. If a cell biologist is looking at this, the social part can be interesting, and if a peace builder is looking at this, the homeostasis part is quite interesting. But my idea is to kind of connect cell biology and peace building and to frame it as a social homeostasis theorem. And the concept here is that if we understand the self-regulating mechanisms amongst biological systems, then we can kind of allow the reinforcement of regulation mechanisms to craft more efficient peace building processes. So that's the concept. It's the fact that we can utilize cell biological concepts and see similarities and mimicry within humans, because we are ourselves, and understand that we can utilize those as a scientific concept to actually aid us in the building of peace. So I'm firstly going to sort of start in the introduction section in the top left-hand corner, where I sort of delve into the idea of the concepts of adaptability, cooperation, and resilience. And those are, of course, very key traits that are needed when we're looking at the merging of different cultures. And I myself am a first-generation immigrant hailing from Kosovo. And so I've understood and acquired knowledge and adjusted to all of these new circumstances. So the concept of peace building is not entirely novel to me as an idea, but exploring it and seeing how we can actually visualize peace in novel ways was something I'd never actually looked at before. And even when applying to this VIP, I didn't know how I could link, or if it was even possible to link, the idea of biological research, artificial intelligence, which is some of my other focus, and looking at how this can sort of interconnect into the idea of peace, because peace is all around us. And I never really understood that as a concept. I would always see peace as, the peace sign, or white doves, or hippies in the 60s and 70s. And this is something that really kind of made me think, and it really expanded my brain into areas I've never ever considered in my life. And yeah, this was a absolutely fantastic opportunity for me to express the concepts I love the most and that are near and dear to me and that I've never had a chance to explore. And so this is sort of my, if you will, novel labeled theorem. So I'm basically, as I said, giving a word to a concept that has been around in scientific research already. So I'm not inventing an entirely new idea, I'm naming it. And so going back to the kind of main title, social homeostasis, to break it down quite simply, you can see the two words, social and homeostasis. Is really funny because you can actually identify the exact two sections that link together. So the social part comes from peace building. The homeostasis section comes from, of course, cellular biology. And moving on to the achieving peace through cellular harmony section of my poster, the concept of sort of homeostasis is a very fundamental biological process, and it's found across all living organisms, in every single component that is alive, basically, in our cells, in our bodies, outside, in plants, organisms. But it's defined specifically as the ability to keep internal stability, even though we're faced with external disturbances that could actually threaten our systems. So inside our bodies, we function because there is an equilibrium between the amount of work the cells are doing, how they're responding to dangers, for example, injuries, or maybe they're rushing to different sites of our body for inflammation, to combat viruses and disease, or stressful environments, like if we're in conflict ourselves, or if we're stressed for an exam, or, in a really stressful situation. This is where homeostasis, one of the most fundamental processes, comes in. And without stability and equilibrium, our bodies would not function the way they do, and we would not be living the way we do. And I noticed from multiple lectures, I've learned about homeostasis since I was probably about 10 or 11 years old. I've always loved biology, and I still obviously do it now as my degree. And I've always just been pondering in my different classes, the more complex these concepts have been getting, the more I've been seeing there's links to real life tangible applications. And I think that's the beauty for me of biology, particularly within the scientific fields, because you can actually apply it to absolutely anything. And so seeing these in lectures, I've seen the way lecturers have been describing the concepts of homeostasis has made me really draw immediate parallels to peace building, which is such an interesting concept and really interesting as to how it's been kind of working in my brain. And so just how our cells and tissues have to really cooperate to promote our organ functionality and our tissues functionality, people have to cooperate to promote peace and stability within communities. So it's really all about community here. And you can see kind of a little diagram of what looks like a dot with two legs. That's what we call our bilayer. So if you were to kind of zoom right into one of our cells, around our cells is a membrane, and that's what keeps the cell intact. Without this membrane, if there's kind of leakages, the cells will burst open, or just evaporate essentially, and that's something that we can't have. So in a way, that kind of bilayer of membrane is our peacekeeper for every single component inside of the cells to make it kind of strong and functional. So that's kind of why I have two different diagrams there of people holding hands, and then the sort of the membranes kind of stacked. It's really just to illustrate how similar the processes are, and it really shocks me to this day to see something like this so similar. So we've looked at the kind of very briefly the cell biology side of things. So what homeostasis is, basically just making sure we have balance within our bodies of all the chemicals and the processes. We need an equilibrium. And then naturally, alongside sort of peace building, that is, of course, an ultra complex process, and it's never going to be linear, just like how homeostasis is never going to be linear. So if we kind of figure out the causes of these conflicts, and if we create like a long-lasting foundation, we need a combination of different things. Stakeholders, approaches, strategies, similar to how our bodies need our cells to work, all of our hormones, the chemicals to work, the gases to allow us to breathe and respire. So there's a lot of parallels to be drawn. And for even more complex matters, there's very different kind of structures of these societal systems, just like how cellular ones have different systems too. So if there's an alteration in one of these different societal systems that make up our society and communities, there's obviously going to cause a ripple effect onto the whole system. And this is the exact same process within our bodies. If there is one cell that does not function properly, that immediately sends a signal to the nearby cells to say, this is a problem, fix it. And it's very much similar to peace building. So through one kind of minor issue, somewhat minor issue in a community, it will still have a ripple effect. And so again, drawing these parallels. And so with this, the rest of the scientific poster, we're going to kind of look at the idea of how we can use these insights and the concept of social homeostasis to really promote harmony and resilience in our societies. Kind of moving on to the last section on the left-hand side. biological homeostasis is very relevant to societal peace. And to make sure, as an example, that our bodies are remaining in an equilibrium, to make sure everything is set kind of in a balance, the process of homeostasis inside our bodies, just to go back to the cell biological side, is actually kind of kept alive via biological interactions. Two key ones: feedback loops and cellular communication. So if we look at the idea of feedback loops, they are very much self-regulatory systems. So when the output is created, so say for example there's an injury in our bodies, or we've touched, a good example is touching a hot pan. So our hand has just touched the hot pan and we have reacted by moving away. That concept is a feedback loop, because our bodies need to understand that that is an issue. We cannot be touching a hot pan. So the output is going to have an impact on the way the process is created. So in this sense, the kind of feedback loop of our hand touching the hot pan is that we remove our hand away. So we've kind of increased the movement to make sure that we are actually kind of okay. And the feedback loop here, as I said, is just to sort of increase the movement, to make sure that we never do that again, essentially, to protect ourselves. And therefore cellular communication as well. So the two different concepts involve cells working together, literally talking to one another to make sure that the cell types are working together to maintain general health, to maintain our functionality. And so we have sort of checkpoints and balances to make sure that everything is working okay. So it's all about talking, communication, and feedback loops to make sure that we have everything in line. And if there's something wrong in our bodies, then we can increase or decrease those levels to get it back to normal. And on the concept of homeostasis, therefore, this is why I kind of bring together the novel theorem, I guess, to comprehend and promote societal harmony. And there's quite a few kind of pieces of current literature, specifically the paper called Homeostasis Theory of Wellbeing, published in 2024, so very, very recently, in January, I believe. And it doesn't exactly say anything to do with society. It focuses more on homeostasis, but I drew a lot of parallels from that and put it into peace building context. And so this theory now, if we're bringing the idea of homeostasis needing feedback loops requiring cellular communication, if we combine those and we look at the idea of humans in general and peace building and conflict and understanding ourselves, then we can sustain balance as a community via adaptive processes and networks for collaboration. So remember the concept of feedback loops and cellular communication. There is a direct parallel. So for feedback loops, we have adaptive processes in which social structures and policies allow a community to adapt to any internal stresses. Similar to how a feedback loop will alert us, hey, it's a hot pan. We will also have different policies in place, ideally, to reduce political unrest. But of course, this is never going to be stable, and it can change and flip-flop around depending on the context. And so that's the concept of an adaptive process being in line to a feedback loop. So there's immediate parallels drawn there. And then just how cells need to communicate, we also require networks for collaboration as a more peace-building kind of adaptation. And so for the sort of networks of collaboration, we need people to talk together, to interact between these different groups to actually accomplish these mutual objectives. So without talking to one another and reaching out to different people in power and expressing, kind of issues and expressing worries, then there's not going to be any sort of functionality. And then homeostasis and that balance, social homeostasis, would not exist. So it's really important that we actually see these not only from a biological perspective, but understand how they sort of work together. So now I'm just going to shift over to the direct right-hand side of the presentation. We'll come to the middle at the very, very end. And how, looking at the idea of actual case studies, so there have been some different kind of frameworks similar to the concept of societal homeostasis. An example is the quite old now Uniting for Peace framework resolution in the 1950s that actually looked at the idea of collaboration. So not directly looking at the biological aspect, but I drew parallels. I was combining everything. And how in the 1950s they utilized this to clearly define roles and to tell peace building agencies, this is how we should collaborate. It's literally like a guide to ensure there's communication channels, align objectives, everything being executed. And the effect this framework had was it really enhanced activity coordination during peace missions from the 1950s until now. And it really, really made a positive kind of impact. And I guess it occurred through indirect imitation of cellular cooperation. Again, people probably weren't aware of all of these cooperations at that time. And of course, it was highly effective where complex interventions were required for different wars, for example, and actually made the concepts easier to understand, especially when it's set as a framework. So that had very positive effects. And then another one was the adaptive peace program, which was inspired by, indirectly again, the adaptive nature of cells reacting to stress and to injury. So always making sure that we are kind of changing our frameworks in line and in accordance with current day and technological advancements, and looking at different conflict resolution tactics that are used in line with the changing conditions of conflict zones. So again, compared to internal cellular healing, making sure we're changing and adapting where possible, just like how we had the cellular communications and the feedback loops in line with the adaptive and collaboration mechanisms. And so this impact was quite large. It demonstrated across addressing these huge obstacles and decreased duration of conflict de-escalation, which you can read more about in the citations. And then I guess another bit of analysis, I looked at more literature, of course, as an entire list of citations, and I tried to examine different concepts and literature directly related to the idea of this social homeostasis. And there was a huge interdependence between cell biology and societal dynamics. It was a huge link. And there was actually two actually quite significant points of analysis. The book called Symbiosis and Separation Towards a Psychology of Culture was one of the few that really kind of explored the concept of mutualistic interactions in nature and how these different interactions can serve as a model to foster cooperative partnerships. So looking at how we can speak to one another and how antagonist society groups can come together by talking, similar to how kind of symbiosis and separation occurs across animals as well. And so if we kind of connect these concepts, we can have mutually beneficial outcomes, just like what symbiosis is, and decreasing tensions theoretically. And then a novel library entry I submitted as part of this was a paper published by Chatham House on the idea of adaptive peace building. So again, reinforcing the idea of communication, just like how cells communicate, so does society and peace. And this sort of white paper, I guess, explores the idea that society really needs peace building, especially for regions in conflict, but adaptive versions of peace building. We can't be applying the same strategy to the same conflict because no two conflict will ever be the same. So why should our efforts to reinstate peace and to enhance and visualize this peace be the same? Just like how no two people think the same, no two cells will ever be the exact same. So it's really important to make sure that we're constantly being adaptive. And that's where the paper kind of proposes indirect feedback loops and iterations that should be put into place and is sort of a direct how to and do it for kind of restructuring current peace building mechanisms. And that again aligns very well with social homeostasis proposed in this paper. And kind of below the analysis section is just a little bundle of images of cells kind of dividing to show that, you know, growth will occur once there's communication, and no two cells can divide unless they have communicated and signaled to one another that it's time to grow through chemicals and through hormones. And sort of my conclusion of this part, and then I will shift onto the middle, was the idea that there can definitely be a future imagined in where societies achieve equilibrium via the principles that I've explained here, resembling homeostasis. And so in the future that I envision, societies will be able to sort of establish networks that mirror symbiotic relationships amongst cells in an organism, to make sure that everybody in society is sort of collaborating well and achieving shared objectives. Just like how cells have to work together to make sure that they're functioning, for example, for one of our organs, like our heart, to make sure they're pumping blood the correct way. Without communication and without symbiotic relationships, society will not necessarily be as strong as it could be. And then, of course, reacting well to external and internal pressures. So replicating the constantly changing equilibrium in living processes and making sure that we are looking internally as well as externally. So looking at self-peace as well as looking outward to peace outside. And then I guess finally also developing strategies for conflict resolution that are efficient and accurate. Just like how biological feedback mechanisms have checkpoints to make sure the cells are going along the right way, so should conflict resolution. Little kind of more checkpoints happening. And I guess on a more personal level, I'm really impressed by the interdependence that exists within every single aspect of life. And of course, it's difficult to be able to sit and understand and to get antagonist society groups together. It can never be easy, and it maybe will never be achieved in a more pessimistic sense. But in my optimistic sense, if we apply these sort of biological concepts together, we can definitely craft a sort of unified community structure. And again, as I mentioned in the very beginning, connecting biology and peace building, two things that are so near and dear and directly impact me every single day, is not something I ever would have considered. So I'm so grateful and beyond delighted to have had the opportunity to allow my thoughts to go wild with the concept of peace building. And again, I'm very much aware that peace will never be instated and installed overnight. But the more aware people are about what peace is and the concepts of cell biology globally, the better off we'll definitely be as a society. So that's sort of the two kind of sections as a presentation on the outside. And then to just very quickly run through the center of this presentation, or this poster. So as I kind of mentioned, we're looking at connecting cells and peace building. And I found it very interesting to kind of see when I was creating this presentation that the two cells interacting on the left in the middle of the black panel, these are kind of just random cells that have been illustrated and drawn to showcase there's a receptor on one, so there's a kind of hook on one side to absorb a signal from another cell. So it's sort of communicating. And then seeing the handshake as well and the kind of peace building and, typical reinstating kind of positive affirmations, if you will. You can automatically see the parallels, and it's the most interesting concept, and it really makes you think and understand that everything is connected in the sense of making sure that we are communicating and making sure that we're taking everything into consideration, because just like how we are all the same, we are also all made up of cells. So it's all very much connected in this, I guess, interdisciplinary process. And just a little bit of a how-to, I really like kind of stating how we can actually do something, making and taking action points from different presentations I give. So there's some kind of steps that you can actually identify social homeostasis across communities yourself. So first step, just like how cell biology is going to categorize cells and organs in our bodies, identify initially the fundamental components to our society or to your community. So looking at the individual as part of it, looking at the groups, looking at the institutions, just like how we look at the cells and the tissues and the organs, and then looking at how these components in society interact. So how are they talking to one another? What are the ways they are communicating and sending signals, like how cells communicate to send signals in their pathways, which I will not get into, because if you saw the pathways of biology, you would be repelled. So you will not need to see all of the different complex mechanisms. And then for the third step, identify these different feedback loops in real life. So we have these different cells working together, but they're obviously going to function in a sort of circular system and a loop manner. Things like legal systems, social norms. And then once you've categorized those feedback loops, then look at the external and internal threats that are then factors to these communities. Things like economic crises, political turmoil, conflict, unrest, things like this. And identifying maybe even for the individual, like what could the individual be going through? What sort of traumas or stresses could then lead to them kind of acting out? and then thereby contributing to the external threat factors as well. Then once you've kind of looked at the different factors, looking at that concept, then look at brainstorming techniques that we can use to adapt to these stresses. Just like how our cells will adapt by releasing more hormone or reducing the amount of hormone or chemicals or blood pressure, things like peacekeeping interventions, then policy modification. So just having a think as to how we can actually categorize and see a sort of funnel approach until we get to the most final point, the highest level in a very ideal optimistic world. I appreciate how optimistic this is. Then developing these mechanisms in the form of maybe using artificial intelligence, as I gave in a different presentation, or actually speaking to peace builders and to people in higher powers and higher positions in society that can actually, take these changes and do something with them. And then kind of looking at how we can have different feedback levels and monitoring and checkpoints, similar to how our bodies sustain themselves. And if we have the ability to kind of execute on all 6 of these steps, then we've effectively explored, understood, and executed on the idea of social homeostasis. But naturally, as with anything, it's not so great to be always optimistic about all of these different concepts. But I've kind of given an overview of pros and cons, if you will, if you couldn't already tell by the tick and the cross. So for the first part, I guess the positives of this model of social homeostasis as a concept is definitely interdisciplinary thinking for unique perspectives. So really understanding that you can combine so many different concepts of peace visualization and another topic. You could combine psychology and peace, and philosophy and peace, and maths and generating mathematical models for peace. It's really possible. And it really emphasizes a systemic balance within communities and shows that we can actually achieve an equilibrium. And I guess it's also a more tangible concept that maybe members of the public will understand a little bit more, although we can't really see directly those bilayers and those membranes that communicate within our bodies. We know that we are made up of cells. It's the most basic kind of knowledge. And so if we compare that to something more kind of abstract as the concept of peace building, it's nice to have something to quantify it and to compare it, because we all like to do that. And there you go, it's also backed by science. That's always good. And it's another effective means of public engagement for peace building. If we can say, look, a cell could also be, contributing towards peace building, people will actually be kind of more engaged in the research and the understanding of what's going on. But I guess some more kind of negative aspects to these models, not necessarily bad points, but rather things to consider before taking this as a sole theorem for peace building. That if we apply these cell biology principles to social context, you're naturally going to oversimplify things. So it's a little too simple as a concept. Naturally, our cells work in deeper forms, and peace building is not just a let's categorize everything and add our own opinions and, adapt by making different strategies. It's not ever going to be that easy, but it's nice for quantification. And of course, it's, again, quite hypothetical, not necessarily there, as all of this kind of topic is very subjective and can be taken in any forms. Human societies are not as predictable as cell biology. We know that our cells are going to work this way because of thousands of years of research and the fact that we are alive as a species. But of course, you're never going to be able to sit and say, okay, this is what's going to happen in this area. We can make, again, mathematical models, and we can predict. We can use artificial intelligence and other aspects of STEM to quantify the different concepts of conflict and peace building, but we're never going to be 100% predictable. And of course, if we were to create these systems, it's going to be costly, requires lots of resources, money, time, people's time. Time is really of essence these days, and attention as well. The fact that we have all of these technological advancements, but it's quite difficult to get attention to one thing. But maybe this concept of sort of social homeostasis will grab people's attention and allow for people to actually be intrigued by it and to see this as a novel idea that could be taken so much further. Just as a summary, I had a lot of references for this that I didn't want to kind of overload on the paper, so I've done quite an interesting thing by using technology, and allowing people to sort of scan the QR code in the corner and to see an entire list on a separate Google Sheet. So if you're interested in kind of further reading, looking at further concepts of peace building, or just want to know where my exact citations lie in the text, you can just scan that. Hopefully it will work, and you'll be able to kind of be directed to a Google page, and you can see the entire list. But thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I hope you take this concept of social homeostasis either as a theorem for you to be inspired by and to continue in the world of peace building, or you sit and do more research, or you even use your own skills and your own interests to link peace building and your own concept together in a novel way. Thank you so much for watching.